Have you ever wondered what secrets were buried beneath the floodwaters? Secrets so dark, so deeply disturbing, that even heaven went silent after they were sealed away. What if the real horror didn't end when the giants fell, but started with the women who carried them? These were not innocent bystanders. These were women who made a choice. They chose desire over devotion, passion over purity. They opened their hearts and their lives to beings from a dimension never meant to touch the human world. Fallen angels, rebels who defied the Most High. And for that choice, for that unholy covenant forged in the shadows of heaven's rebellion, a price was paid. A price no pulpit has dared name. Until now, this is not simply a story about fallen angels. This is what came after. After the war in the heavens, after the Nephilim were swallowed by floodwaters, after the earth was scrubbed clean of their corruption. Because when the flood receded and the mud dried and the silence returned, justice had not yet finished its work. There were still debts to collect. And God did not send a messenger. He sent a general, Archangel Michael, commander of heaven's armies. The blade of divine reckoning was dispatched not just to bind the fallen angels. He turned his eyes toward the women, the human women who had willingly crossed into darkness. What Michael did next would echo through the spiritual realm for eternity. It would leave a mark that myth still carries today. Are those souls still out there? Do they linger in ancient stories as sirens, as wailing spirits, as voices that rise from deep waters, soaked in sorrow and unresolved rage? Before we go further, if you feel that pull, that unnamed weight pressing on your spirit right now, drop 777 inches the comments. You are not imagining it. And to everyone walking this journey with us, thank you. Your presence is the light that helps us lift the veil. Stay close. Because what Archangel Michael did was not merely punishment, it was prophecy. And once you hear it, the ancient stories will never look the same again. Let's begin. Archangel Michael's shocking act against the wives of fallen angels. Have you ever heard the saying that one glance, just one single look, can change the entire course of destiny? What if that look didn't come from a man? What if it came from the most powerful beings heaven ever created? What if I told you that a single downward gaze from the heights of glory was enough to unravel the divine order that God himself had established? This is not just another tale of forbidden love. Don't let anyone reduce it to that. This is the greatest tragedy of love at first sight ever recorded in human or spiritual history, one so catastrophic, so cosmically consequential, that it shook the very balance between heaven and earth to its foundation. In the heavenly realms, everything was exactly as God designed it to be, pure, orderly, radiant beyond any human description. The angels, God's messengers, his warriors, his holy instruments were fulfilling their sacred assignments, singing praises that made the stars tremble, maintaining the breathtaking beauty of a creation still fresh from God's hands, standing as sentinels of divine law, immovable, faithful, brilliant. They were built to serve, built to obey. Their loyalty was not questioned because it had never needed to be. And then something shifted. One day, as they cast their gaze downward from the heights of heaven, their eyes fell upon the earth below, and what they saw stopped them cold. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't sin, at least, not yet. What they saw was something far more dangerous than either. It was beauty, but not the kind of beauty they had ever encountered. Not the flawless perfection of celestial beings. Not the blazing glory of stars being spoken into existence. This was something raw, something that trembled and bled and laughed and wept. It was human beauty, imperfect, vulnerable, achingly real, and it reached up through the atmosphere and grabbed them in a place they never knew they had. The women of the earth, with their deep emotions, their quiet strength, their mortal warmth, stirred something inside these angels that had never once been awakened, not in all of eternity, not through all the ages of creation. How could beings forged in the fires of holiness begin to hunger for flesh and fragility? What was it about these women, mortal, temporary, dust-bound, that made eternal and wise celestial warriors willing to throw away everything they were created to be? Genesis 6-2 records the exact moment the divine boundary cracked open. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves from any they chose. That moment, that first look, it was the spark the single lit match dropped into a room soaked in gasoline. It ignited a chain of rebellion, corruption, and divine judgment that would eventually swallow the entire world. But the deeper question demands an answer. If even angels, eternal, holy, heaven-formed, can fall because of desire, what does that tell you about the raw, terrifying power of human love? And what does it warn us about the danger of pursuing love outside the boundaries God established? Because here is where the story turns dark. The angels, once completely untouched by temptation, began experiencing something they had no framework for. Something foreign, something that grew louder the longer they fed it. But with every passing glance toward earth, that whisper became a voice, and that voice became a roar they could no longer silence. This wasn't admiration. Not anymore. It had curdled into something else entirely. Craving, obsession, a fire burning in hearts that were never designed to hold earthly flame. These weren't minor angels either. These were the sons of God, the heavenly watchers, the guardians of divine order, the ones assigned to protect the boundary between heaven and earth. And yet, each time they looked down, that boundary blurred a little more. The light that had always radiated from them, pure, steady, unwavering, began to flicker. Their glory, meant to reflect only the holiness of God, started dimming as forbidden thoughts crept in like shadows at dusk. Meanwhile, down on earth, the women lived their lives in complete, peaceful ignorance of the cosmic war brewing above their heads. They baked bread. They sang. They tended fields and told stories by firelight. They held their children and watched the stars. They had no idea, not even a whisper of a clue, that their laughter, their beauty, their ordinary human warmth had become the undoing of heaven's most elite guardians. Simply by being human, these women had become the unwitting center of divine rebellion. Have you ever felt watched? Not by human eyes, but by something you couldn't name. Something that pressed against the edges of your awareness. That's precisely what these women began to feel. A presence, an intensity, eyes they couldn't see but somehow sensed. It wasn't fear exactly, but it wasn't peace either. It was something in between, electric, heavy, charged with a meaning they couldn't decode. They felt chosen, though no one had told them why. Suddenly, ordinary days felt different. The breeze against their faces carried a strange electricity. The silence of the night seemed to breathe, to press in, to whisper things just below the edge of hearing. Every heartbeat felt a little louder. Every glance over the shoulder a little more urgent. As it is written in Jude 1-6, and the angels who did not keep their proper domain but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Heaven was growing restless. The air between realms had thickened with tension so dense you could feel it in your bones. A choice was forming, slow, inevitable, catastrophic one that would send shockwaves through eternity itself. Ecclesiastes 3:1 tells us, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven." What happens when eternal creatures attempt to rewrite a timeline that belongs only to their Creator? The world itself held its breath. Animals grew restless without knowing why. The wind carried a low hum. Like creation, bracing for an impact it could sense, but not stop. The invisible barrier between the eternal and the earthly was thinning, stretched thinner with every forbidden gaze, every whispered longing, every moment of heavenly hesitation, and the angels knew it. They were fully aware they were walking a dangerous road, one lit not by holy fire, but by the flames of their own rebellion. They knew the line ahead wasn't merely forbidden, it was sacred. Every fiber of their being had been built for obedience, for praise, for absolute purity of purpose. And yet something had broken open inside them. The longer they gazed toward earth, the more their heavenly duties blurred. the more they dreamed of something they were never meant to touch. Each time the thought of descending crossed their minds, guilt would surge through them. Like a wave, they remembered the celestial courts, the blazing glory of God's throne, the honor and the weight of bearing his light. But then the other voice would rise, stronger, more seductive, more relentless. What if there is something more? What if these humans, these fragile, feeling, breakable creatures, are a doorway into an experience we can never taste from up here? Questions that had never once existed in the mind of an angel now echoed like thunder. What does it feel like to love with the full depth of human longing? To feel the warmth of mortal touch? To know the ache of joy and heartbreak intertwined? What would it feel like to be truly known, not as a servant, not as a soldier, but as a lover? Their hearts, once filled with nothing but the blazing light of God's presence, began to carry shadows, shadows of yearning, shadows of want. And as Isaiah 14:12 reminds us, in the story of Lucifer's own fall, desire outside of God's will is the seed from which all rebellion grows. The angels stood trembling on the edge, torn between what they were created to be and what they were secretly, desperately, dangerously longing to become. The pull was no longer just a feeling. It had become a force, a current pulling them downward toward a world they were never meant to enter. Day by day, the pull grew stronger. Day by day, more angels found themselves powerless against the fascination. What had begun as a private, silent curiosity was becoming something organized, something intentional, something conspiratorial. A gathering was forming in the shadows of heaven, and nothing, not duty, not glory, not the memory of God's throne, was strong enough to stop what was coming next. One by one, they began to watch, not out of duty, not out of divine assignment, out of pure, consuming desire. What they saw down on that earth enchanted them in ways no heavenly experience ever had. Laughter dancing around open fires, gentle embraces between two people who chose each other freely, tears shed alone under the cold light of the moon. These were emotions they had witnessed from a distance for ages but never once felt, and with every new sunrise, every new scene of raw human life playing out below them, their resolve began to crumble like ancient stone under relentless water. Think about what these angels had already seen. They had been present at the dawn of creation. They had stood in breathless witness as God opened his mouth and spoke galaxies into existence, scattered stars, like a man tosses dust from his palm. They had sung with voices that shook the cosmos as the oceans were carved into their basins and the mountains were pushed upward from the deep. They had beheld glory that no human mind has ever come close to imagining. And yet, all of that was beginning to fade. Every last trace of heavenly wonder was being eclipsed in their hearts by a yearning they could no longer control. The throne room of God, once the center of their entire existence, now felt distant, dim, secondary, and in its place burned something they had no name for, something mortal, something forbidden, something that grew louder every time they looked down. Each angel stood at a crossroads, stay loyal to their divine assignment, the sacred post they had held since before the foundations of the earth were laid, or surrender to the seductive promise of a love they could never truly possess. What is it that makes the forbidden so utterly irresistible? Could it be that the very boundaries God establishes are the ones designed to test the deepest, most hidden truths of our hearts? Heaven and earth were never designed to intertwine this way. These two realms were created with their own laws, their own purposes, their own divine separation. That distance wasn't cruelty, it was architecture. Sacred, intentional, necessary. But the angels were now willing to demolish everything they had ever been: celestial warriors, eternal messengers, sworn servants of the Most High, for a fleeting, fragile chance at mortal love. Did they even understand the cost? This was no small decision. Let no one call it curiosity. Let no one soften it with gentle language. This was an act of cold, deliberate rebellion. The Book of Enoch tells us precisely how organized this rebellion became. 200 angels gathered together, not scattered, not individual, but coordinated, led by a being named Samyaza. And there, in the shadows between realms, they made a pact. They swore an oath. bound together by equal parts fear and desire, that they would descend to the earth as one. That way, none of them would face judgment alone. If heaven came for one, heaven would have to come for all. But here is the terrible truth about that oath. Judgment was never going to skip over them, because they held hands on the way down. Their choice would not only alter their own eternal destiny, it would rupture the world. It would give birth to giants, to bloodshed, to a spreading wickedness so complete, so total, so absolute, that God himself would grieve over the very creation his hands had formed. Genesis 6-5 stands as one of the most devastating verses in all of Scripture. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Every inclination. All the time. That is not corruption at the edges, that is rot at the core. The heavens were about to shake. The earth was about to groan under a weight it was never built to carry. And those angels so captivated, so intoxicated, so utterly consumed by human beauty, were about to learn a truth that has echoed through every generation since that day. No matter how compelling the reason, no matter how powerful the emotion, some divine laws are not suggestions, they are walls. And walls exist because on the other side of them is destruction. The moment these angels, no longer messengers of God, but now something darker, something fallen, set foot upon the earth, a strange energy rippled outward through the natural world. But do not mistake this for wonder. This was not the kind of magic that heals or restores or lifts the human spirit. This was the kind of beauty that pulls you under. Picture the most breathtaking person you have ever seen in your life. Now multiply that by 1,000. Now, strip away every trace of human imperfection and replace it with something otherworldly, something that doesn't quite belong in this dimension. That is what these fallen angels looked like when they walked among men. But their beauty was not merely visual, it was supernatural, a force, an atmosphere. They did not walk like men. They moved as though gravity had agreed to make an exception for them, gliding with impossible grace through air that seemed to part in reverence. Their voices were not speech, they were melody, pure, seductive, resonating not just in the ears but deep in the soul, in the place where your deepest longings live. And the light? They did not reflect it. They wore it like a second skin. When they entered a village, time itself seemed to slow down. Farmers dropped their tools mid-swing. Mothers paused mid-sentence. Children frozen beside them. Birds went silent. Flowers leaned. The very air shimmered like heat rising off summer pavement. Every eye turned, unable to look away. Looking at them was like staring directly into the sun. It hurt. It overwhelmed. It burned. And still, not one person could turn their face from it. The women who encountered them felt something ignite within them. An ache. A hunger with no name. A fire in the chest that felt less like attraction and more like awakening. This wasn't ordinary desire. It felt like destiny arriving in human form. But 2 Corinthians 11:14 cuts through that feeling like cold steel. Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. If the Prince of Darkness can package himself as something radiant and divine, how much more devastatingly deceptive could these fallen beings be? Their smiles were perfect and hiding ancient secrets. Their eyes shimmered with starlight and carried the cold weight of heavenly rebellion behind them. They knew these women completely. Their fears, their dreams, their hidden wounds, their private longings, all of it was already known before a single word was spoken, and they used every piece of that knowledge to become precisely what each woman had always ached for. This was not romance. This was a strategy. The longer these women stayed in their presence, the more they began to change. Slowly at first, a strange glow behind the eyes, a shift in energy that others noticed but couldn't explain. It was as though the corrupted divinity these fallen angels carried was seeping through contact, altering these women at a cellular, spiritual level. Body, mind, soul. The ordinary world stopped satisfying them. The warmth of a human husband felt lukewarm. The rhythm of daily life felt suffocating. They had tasted something from another realm, and now everything this world offered tasted like ash by comparison. Were they chosen, or were they targeted? The fallen angels had not descended randomly. From the heights of their obsession, they had already marked their selections. The most radiant, the most alluring, the ones whose spirits blazed brightest, even in earthly darkness. And once they arrived, they deployed everything: divine knowledge, celestial charm, the perfectly crafted illusion of a love too beautiful to be real, to make these women believe they had found what every human heart searches for. What looked like a dream was the opening scene of a nightmare, because Genesis 6-4 delivers its chilling verdict without apology. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. These were not ordinary children. These were not simply large men or celebrated warriors. These were titans, half angel, half human, carrying divine power with no divine restraint, beings that no human force could contain and no angel could redeem. And the world they were about to inherit, the world their monstrous appetites would reshape, was already bleeding. When divine beings cross sacred lines, when love curdles into lust, when covenants are forged in darkness rather than light, the consequences do not stay contained. They spread, they corrupt, they multiply, and heaven, patient, watching, grieving, was running out of silence. Now let me pull back the veil and show you the terrifying truth that most people never stop long enough to fully absorb. The Nephilim. Say that word slowly. Let it land. Because what I am about to describe is not mythology. It is not allegory. It is not ancient storytelling dressed up for dramatic effect. This is the documented, scripturally grounded, historically echoed reality of what walked this earth when heaven's boundary was violated, when fallen angels took human women as wives and produced something the universe had never been designed to contain. These were not ordinary children. They were not simply large babies or unusually strong toddlers. They were the cursed fruit of angelic rebellion, colliding with human vulnerability, beings born into a world that had no category for what they were, no language to describe them, no cage strong enough to hold them. From the moment they took their first breath, something was wrong. Profoundly, irreversibly, cosmically wrong. They were too large for cradles, too powerful for swaddling cloth. Mothers who survived giving birth to them, and not all did, looked into the eyes of their newborns and saw something staring back that no mother should ever have to see. Not innocence, not helplessness, something ancient, something that recognized her without ever having learned her face. And they did not stop growing. Most children reach a point where their bodies settle, where growth slows to a gentle crawl toward adulthood. Not the Nephilim. Their growth accelerated. Each week brought new height, new mass, new impossible strength. Within months, they were the size of grown men. Within years, they were something that had no comparison in the known world. They became giants. Not the giants of fairy tales, lovable, clumsy, misunderstood. Real giants, towering over the tallest trees, their shadows consuming entire streets when they moved through a village. When a Nephilim walked, the earth didn't just feel it. The earth announced it. The ground shook beneath their massive feet like a drumbeat, warning everyone within range to run, to hide, to pray. When they wept, and they did weep, because they carried their mother's emotions, the sound rolled outward like thunder, tumbling through mountain passes, rattling shutters and sending livestock scattering in blind panic. When they shouted in rage, and they raged often, entire villages heard it from miles away and bolted their doors and put out their fires and held their children tight and begged God for morning to come quickly. Their strength was unlike anything the natural world had produced. Stone walls that took human hands years to build, torn through in seconds. Ancient forests uprooted like weeds pulled from soft soil. Armies of trained soldiers, armed and organized and desperate, crushed without meaningful effort, like a man swatting flies from his dinner table. But here is what made them far more dangerous than their size alone. The Nephilim inherited the worst of both worlds simultaneously. From their fallen angel fathers they received celestial power, raw, immense, perception that cut through darkness like a blade, strength that belonged in heaven's war rooms, not on earthly soil. But they received none of the divine restraint that kept that power from becoming annihilation. None of the holy discipline, none of the reverence for boundaries that even unfallen angels carried as second nature. And from their human mothers, they inherited the full emotional spectrum of humanity: jealousy that burned, white-hot, pride that refused every correction, rage that needed no real provocation, appetite that recognized no limit. But without the human conscience to regulate any of it, without the still, small voice that tells a person, stop, enough, this is too far, that voice was simply absent. Close your eyes for one moment and truly picture this. Think about the emotional intensity of a 2-year-old in full meltdown, that absolute, total, all-consuming fury that doesn't reason, doesn't negotiate, doesn't respond to logic. Now place that emotional volatility inside a body the size of a 4-story building. Now give that body the physical strength to level every structure on your city block in under a minute. This was not a fairy tale. This was not an ancient exaggeration passed down by frightened storytellers. This was the daily reality of human civilization during the age of the Nephilim. This was Tuesday morning for the people who had the devastating misfortune of living in proximity to these creatures. Have you ever wondered, truly wondered, what it would feel like to live in that kind of fear? Not the fear of storms that eventually pass, not the fear of wild animals that can be hunted, trapped, driven back, but the fear of your neighbors, the dread of hearing footsteps approaching that you recognize as belonging to something that views you as either an obstacle or a meal. That was life under the Nephilim. Entire cities restructured themselves around the terror. Farmers abandoned fertile fields rather than risk being seen working them when the giants came hungry. Fishermen pulled their boats ashore and left them rotting rather than be caught out on open water. Markets went silent. Trade collapsed. The ordinary rhythms of human life, the rhythms God had designed humanity to inhabit with dignity and purpose, were crushed under the weight of giants who took without asking and destroyed without thinking. When the Nephilim came, and they came regularly, they consumed everything in their path. Livestock gone in minutes, entire harvests that families had spent seasons cultivating stripped bare in a single sitting. And when the food ran out, when the animals were gone and the fields were empty and the storehouses were hollowed out, the Book of Enoch does not flinch in its description of what happened next. They consumed all the acquisitions of men, and when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. Read that again. Let it reach you. These weren't monsters from the outside pressing against the city gates. These were beings born of the earth itself, half human, carrying human blood from their mother's veins, now consuming the very people from whom they came. Humanity was being devoured by its own forbidden offspring. And what made it even more unbearable, what elevated this beyond mere savage destruction into something genuinely, deeply terrifying, was that the Nephilim were not mindless brutes. They were not animals operating on pure instinct with no capacity for thought. They were intelligent. They could speak with articulation and precision. They could reason through problems, calculate outcomes, anticipate resistance. They could plot, and with that God-given cognitive capacity corrupted and unrestrained, came something that raw, physical power alone could never manufacture. Cruelty with intention behind it. There is a category of evil that is somehow more disturbing than blind destruction. It is destruction that knows exactly what it is doing and chooses to continue anyway. That is what the Nephilim represented. Power without conscience, intelligence without morality, strength without mercy, a combination that turned the ancient world into something that no human language was ever quite equipped to fully describe. This was not chaos stumbling through history. This was judgment beginning to unfold, slow, grinding, suffocating long before the first raindrop of the flood ever fell from the sky. The Nephilim were not simply a threat to individual villages or isolated communities. They were a systemic threat to the entire architecture of creation. Every design God had built into the natural world order, hierarchy, The dignity of human life, made in his image, was being dismantled, giant stride by giant stride. Heaven watched, and heaven did not watch with indifference. Heaven watched with the particular sorrow of a parent watching a beloved home being burned to the ground by arsonists who were never supposed to exist. The grief was real. The outrage was building, and underneath both the grief and the outrage, something far more consequential was forming. A response. Because the God who spoke the stars into position and breathed life into the first human did not design his creation to become the feeding ground of corrupted hybrids born from angelic rebellion. What had been made in beauty and purpose was being consumed by something unnatural, something that had crawled into existence through a door that should have stayed permanently sealed. And God, patient beyond all human understanding, slow to anger beyond what any theologian can fully articulate, had now seen enough. Something this unnatural could not go on forever. Something this unnatural was not going to go on forever. The response was coming. And when it came, it would not arrive quietly, high above the chaos seated on the throne of eternity, from a vantage point no human eye has ever beheld, and no human mind has ever fully grasped. God looked down. He looked down upon the earth he had once stood over and declared very good, the earth he had shaped with his own hands, the earth into which he had breathed the first human breath, the earth he had designed as a garden of purpose, of dignity, of sacred order. And what he saw was unrecognizable. That good creation was unraveling thread by thread. The harmony he had spoken into existence, the breathtaking, interlocking design of a world built to reflect his glory, was being drowned out, swallowed whole, replaced by the sound of terror and bloodshed that rose from every corner of the earth like a wound that would not close. What he had formed with infinite care was now being crushed under the feet of giants who were never meant to exist. The Nephilim, those cursed, unnatural offspring of angelic rebellion and human vulnerability, had transformed God's beloved earth into a battlefield of shadows, a landscape of sorrow so deep and so wide that entire generations of human beings had been born into it, lived inside it, and died inside it without ever knowing a single day of peace. And the ones suffering most were not the powerful. They were not the mighty. They were the very people God had knelt down and breathed life into with his own mouth, his beloved humans. Every single day, the cries of the innocent rose upward like smoke from a fire that no one could extinguish. Mothers pressing their children into corners of darkness, whispering for silence, praying the giants would pass without stopping. Entire villages emptied overnight, families abandoning everything they had built, everything they had grown, everything that represented a life lived with hope, simply to put distance between themselves and the terror. Prayers whispered through tears so constant they had become the only language left. Prayers that asked the only question that mattered anymore. Is anyone up there? Does heaven still see us? Does heaven still care? And here is what you must understand with absolute clarity. God heard every single cry, every whispered prayer, every sob muffled behind a hand in the darkness, every name called out into empty air by a parent who could not find their child. He saw every injustice, every act of cruelty committed by those hybrid abominations against the image bearers he had created with such deliberate love. Not one tear fell to the ground without the God of heaven registering its weight. The Nephilim believed themselves unstoppable. They had lived long enough under the silence of heaven to mistake patience for absence, to mistake restraint for weakness, to look up at the sky and conclude that no response was coming because no one capable of responding existed. They were catastrophically wrong, because the Creator was not blind. He had never been blind, and his anger, slow to rise in the way that only perfect patience can sustain, had finally begun to burn. Not with the reckless heat of human rage, with the steady, consuming, righteous fire of a God who had watched long enough and had decided that enough was now, irrevocably, enough. Judgment was no longer approaching. Judgment was stirring, rising from its seat, reaching for its instrument. That was when heaven's most elite warriors received their orders. The archangels, beings of immense, almost incomprehensible might, forged in the fires of divine justice and hardened by eons of unwavering loyalty, were summoned. Not dispatched casually. Summoned, with the full weight of heaven's authority behind the call. Michael, the commander, the general of God's armies, the one whose very name means, "Who is like God?" a question that contains its own answer, because the answer is no one. Gabriel, the messenger turned instrument of divine announcement, whose presence alone reshapes the atmosphere of any room he enters. Uriel, the flame of truth, whose light exposes what darkness has spent centuries concealing. Raphael, the healer, but understand that healers, when the infection has spread far enough, must sometimes cut before they can restore. These were not gentle celestial figures painted on the ceilings of old churches, soft-faced and decorative. These were generals, warriors forged in the heat of divine justice, veterans of spiritual conflicts that predate human history, beings whose loyalty had never once wavered across the entire span of eternity. But even these entered this particular assignment with a sober awareness that nothing in their vast experience had fully prepared them for what waited on the other side. They were not simply facing fallen spirits or rogue demons scattered across remote places. They were going to war against creatures that carried angelic blood in their veins, hybrids, half heaven, half earth, loaded with power that came directly from the celestial realm, driven by chaos that had no ceiling, wrapped in flesh that made them tangible and physical, and devastatingly dangerous in the natural world. And they were not scattered. They had not retreated to remote corners, hoping to be overlooked. The Nephilim had multiplied. They had organized. They had claimed dominion over the earth with the casual confidence of rulers who had never once been challenged and had long since stopped expecting to be. The earth was their playground. Humanity was their prey. And they had been operating unchallenged for long enough to believe that arrangement was permanent. Could even the mightiest warriors in heaven reverse what had grown this far out of control? The archangels gathered their forces, brilliant, blazing legions that stretched across the skies like living constellations, and they did not rush. This was not the kind of battle that rewards impatience. Every step was measured, every strike calculated with the precision of minds that do not make errors. They had to engage not only with the raw power of heaven, but with the full strategic wisdom that heaven alone possesses. Because here is the unchanging truth about going to war in the name of the Most High. You are never unprepared. For every rebellion that has ever risen, heaven already had its answer waiting. For every corrupted creature that has ever drawn breath in defiance of divine order, there was already a cleansing fire with its name on it. For every darkness that has ever climbed toward the light with violence in its hands, God had already written the final chapter of its story before the first page was ever turned. Romans 12:19 does not leave room for misinterpretation. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. This was not a military operation. This was a divine reckoning. And standing at the front of it, sword in hand, the full, unbearable weight of God's justice concentrated in his grip, was Michael. But even as heaven's armies engaged, even as archangels clashed with giants across fields that trembled and skies that split open with celestial lightning, the scale of what the Nephilim had become made it clear that sword alone would not be sufficient. The corruption had spread too deep. It had saturated the earth too completely. Cutting it out blade by blade would be like trying to empty the ocean with a cup. And so God, in his divine mercy and his fierce, uncompromising justice, made a decision, not just to strike, to cleanse. A plan unlike anything the world had encountered since the moment of its creation, not carried out by sword alone, but by the full, unleashed power of nature itself, the very creation that the Nephilim had mocked, exploited, and treated as their personal inheritance, now conscripted into service as heaven's instrument of judgment. A flood, vast, merciless, divine. It would rise from the depths of the earth and fall from the opened windows of heaven simultaneously. It would sweep away everything that had been defiled, not out of cold rage, but out of something far heavier and far more devastating than anger, out of grief. Genesis 6:13 carries the weight of that divine verdict. like a stone no human hand can lift alone. The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. And then the sky changed. Have you ever watched storm clouds gather, truly gather, not just darken but build, layer upon layer, pressing lower and lower until the air beneath them feels compressed and the light disappears, not gradually, but suddenly, as if something enormous has simply decided that light no longer has permission to exist in this space? Now take that image and multiply it beyond any scale your imagination naturally reaches for. Not darker, obliterating, the kind of darkness that does not merely block the sun but seems to replace it, the kind of black that presses down with physical weight, the kind of absence of light that makes the skin prickle with the awareness that something of incomprehensible magnitude has just shifted in the unseen world. That is how the day of God's judgment announced itself. The sky did not gradually darken. It turned black, completely, instantaneously, as though a sentence had been completed and a period placed with finality at its end. The air thickened. A silence descended that somehow roared the paradox of a quiet, so total and so charged that it felt louder than noise. The pressure built until even the earth beneath people's feet seemed to hold itself rigid, bracing for an impact that had been written into the foundations of time long before any living creature had drawn its first breath. At first, people were confused. Rain was not extraordinary. Storms arrived and eventually departed. This was different in ways that bypassed rational thought and communicated directly to something primal and instinctive in the human body. The clouds did not move. They hovered with the settled, purposeful stillness of a judgment that has already been rendered and is now simply being carried out. The wind did not blow, it screamed, a sound that had no storm to attribute it to, rising from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. And then the rain, not gentle, not cleansing in any way that brought relief. These were not the nourishing drops that coax crops from the soil and fill the cisterns and send children running joyfully into the streets. These were something else entirely. Thick, heavy, laden with the accumulated weight of divine sorrow and divine fury, pressed together into something that fell not like rain but like verdict. Like each drop was a word in a sentence that God had been composing since the first day. The watchers looked down and let desire replace devotion. They did not fall. They pounded, like hammers swung by hands that do not tire, like drums of war beaten by an army that has already won and is simply announcing that fact to those who have not yet accepted it. Hour after hour, day after day, without pause, without softening, without the slightest indication that it would stop before it had accomplished every last thing it had been sent to accomplish. And the Nephilim, those towering, terrifying nightmares of a generation, those creatures who had split mountains with their fists and silenced armies with their roars and consumed everything in their path with complete impunity, began to panic. Watch this carefully, because this is the moment that matters. The confidence drained from them first, that arrogant, unshakable certainty that they were the apex of existence, that nothing above or below them could bring them low, it melted. Gone so quickly it was as though it had never been real, as though it had always been the most fragile thing about them. Their booming laughter, the laughter that had once echoed off canyon walls and sent villagers fleeing in every direction, went silent. They ran. These creatures, who had never run from anything in their existence, turned and ran. They raced toward mountains, those massive hands digging into stone with the desperation of animals that have finally, for the first time, understood what it means to be prey. They climbed toward peaks that once seemed impossibly high, high enough to escape anything. The water rose higher. Strength could not stop it. Height could not outlast it. Intelligence, that cunning, calculating, plotting intelligence that had made the Nephilim so much more terrifying than mere brute force, could not negotiate with it, or outwit it, or find its weakness. The rivers, the rain, the sea, the very creation they had spent their entire existence exploiting and mocking, had risen up in perfect obedience to the voice of its creator. And one by one, even the greatest of them disappeared beneath the surface, like shadows dissolving at dawn, like they had never been. Genesis 7:11. 1, 2 marks the moment with the precision of a divine timestamp. All the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened, and rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. The fallen angels, those once glorious beings whose single act of forbidden desire had set all of this in motion, watched from their chains, bound between heaven and earth, powerless to intervene, forced to watch as everything their rebellion had produced drowned before their eyes. Their children, their legacy, the cities built with forbidden knowledge, the entire architecture of a world they had corrupted and claimed as their own. All of it swallowed. All of it silenced. All of it erased. For 40 days and 40 nights, the rain did not relent. And when it finally ceased, the earth that remained was not the earth that had been. There were no temples to the Nephilim, no bones marking where giants had fallen, no monuments to their dominance, no ruins of their claimed territories. It was as though time itself had been reset, the slate wiped so completely that only the faintest spiritual echoes remained. But one vessel remained, floating in that vast, terrible silence in the middle of an ocean that covered everything that had once been land, was Noah's Ark. A single flame refusing to go out in a world that had gone completely dark. Inside its wooden walls, Noah and his family huddled with the living creatures God had commanded them to preserve. Every heartbeat, a small act of faith against the sound of water pressing against every surface from every direction. This was more than a boat. It was a covenant made physical, a promise wearing the form of timber and pitch, floating on the surface of God's grief as proof that even in his most devastating judgment, mercy had reserved a door. Genesis 7:16 tells us the detail that should stop you cold. Then the Lord shut him in. Not Noah, the Lord. God himself sealed that door, which means when the people pounded on it from outside, and they did pound, the scriptures do not say so explicitly, but the soul of any honest reader knows they did. It was not Noah's hand that refused to open it. It was God's. Because some seasons of grace, once closed, cannot be reopened by human pleading or human regret alone. Outside, the water showed no favoritism. Fields vanished. Forests disappeared. Hills that had stood for centuries became islands for mere hours. Before being consumed, the tallest peaks, those ancient symbols of permanence and majesty, the things human beings have always looked toward when they needed to believe something endures, sank beneath the surface as though they had been constructed from vapor. For 40 days and 40 nights, heaven wept, not only in fury, in grief, the deep, specific grief of a creator watching what he made and loved be destroyed by the consequences of choices he had warned against, pleaded against, waited against, with a patience that outlasted every human understanding of the word. When the waters at last began to pull back slowly, the way enormous things always recede, revealing the changed landscape beneath what emerged was not restoration. Not yet. It was a beginning, a raw, stripped, silent beginning. The Nephilim were gone, not diminished, not defeated and retreating. Gone. Erased from the physical world so completely that the earth itself seemed to exhale. But gone from the physical world does not mean gone from the story, because the story was not finished. The ark had survived. The earth would breathe again. But there was still a group who had not yet received their full accounting. A punishment that water alone could not deliver. A judgment that required something more personal, more specific, more spiritually devastating than a flood. The wives of the fallen angels, the women who had opened their arms to darkness and given birth to the terror that had just been swallowed by the deep. They had survived. But survival, in the economy of divine justice, is not always mercy. Sometimes survival is simply the first room in a much longer reckoning. And Archangel Michael, sword still drawn, assignment not yet complete, was already moving in their direction. When the floodwaters finally receded, when the surface of the earth emerged from beneath those 40 days and 40 nights of divine reckoning, like a man gasping for air after nearly drowning, the world exhaled. The sun touched the face of the earth again, tentatively at first, as though even light needed a moment to assess what remained before committing to shine upon it. Birds returned. The smell of wet soil replaced the smell of judgment, and many people, those who had watched from whatever elevated ground they had clung to, those who had survived in ways they could not fully explain, looked around at the silence and told themselves the same thing human beings have always told themselves when the worst has passed. It's over. The horror is finished. We can breathe now. But for some, the nightmare was not ending. It was only just changing its shape. Hidden beneath the surface of that cleansed and quiet world, beneath the stillness that followed the most catastrophic event in human history, were hearts still locked in chains that no floodwater could wash away. Hearts belonging to the women who had loved the fallen angels, women who had survived when almost nothing else did, women who stood on the newly exposed ground of a reset world and carried something inside them that the flood had been completely unable to touch. Guilt, grief, the particular devastation of a person who has lived long enough to see the full consequence of their choices laid out before them in undeniable, irreversible totality. They had survived. But pause on that word. Turn it over slowly. Because survival is not always what it appears to be on the surface. Sometimes survival is not mercy extending its hand. Sometimes survival is judgment, pulling up a chair, settling in, getting comfortable, preparing to take its time. And for these women, that distinction was about to become the defining reality of whatever remained of their lives. Close your eyes and try to inhabit this for a moment. Not as a distant observer reading ancient history, but as a human being with a chest that knows what it means to love someone completely. Imagine giving yourself fully, without reservation, with every fiber of your emotional and spiritual being to someone who seemed to have been sculpted from pure light. Someone whose presence made the air around them feel charged with meaning. Someone whose eyes held the knowledge of eternities you had never witnessed. Whose voice carried harmonics that no human throat had ever produced. Whose very proximity made you feel simultaneously chosen and undone. These women had believed with absolute conviction that what they felt was love. Sacred, fated, cosmically ordained love. The kind of love that justifies everything. The kind of love that answers every question and silences every doubt with a single look. They had believed it was destiny. But destiny had another name, and that name was deception, wrapped in the most radiant packaging the fallen realm knew how to construct. And now standing on the barren, washed clean surface of a world that no longer looked anything like the one they had known, those angelic husbands were gone. Not gone the way humans go when they die and leave behind grief that eventually softens into memory. Gone in a way that offered none of the consolations that ordinary loss provides. Not dead. Something considerably worse than dead. Imprisoned. 2 Peter 2-4 does not soften the description. For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness, to be reserved for judgment. Chains of darkness, not metaphorical chains, not symbolic imprisonment. Actual spiritual bondage in actual darkness, sealed away in deep places beyond any reach, reserved not for release, but for a final judgment still to come at the end of all things. Some cast into valleys so deep they exist below the threshold of the natural world. Others sealed into spiritual realms so thoroughly locked that not a whisper could escape through the barrier. They could not return, could not speak, could not send even the faintest signal across the distance that now separated them from the women they had once held. Those arms, the ones that had once wrapped around their wives with a warmth that felt like it came from somewhere beyond this world, because it did, were now bound by divine command, fixed, immovable, silent forever, until the judgment seat summoned them to account. And so, the women stood alone, completely, devastatingly, cosmically alone. Can you hold that image for a moment without flinching away from it? Because it deserves to be held. These were not faceless figures in an ancient story. These were women with names, with memories, with the full weight of human emotional capacity pressing down on them from the inside. Women who had watched their children, those enormous, terrifying, world-altering children, be swallowed by water that answered to a voice their fathers had once served before they chose rebellion over obedience. Some of them collapsed, not the graceful, cinematic collapse of theatrical grief, but the ugly, gasping, total system failure collapse of a person whose legs simply will not hold what the heart has just been forced to carry, down onto their knees on the wet, exposed earth of a world that had been washed clean of everything they had known and loved, and, God help them, helped destroy. Picture it with full clarity. Standing at the edge of a horizon that stretches in every direction without a single familiar landmark remaining. Every tree that once marked the boundary of your village, gone. Every face you knew outside your own family, gone. Every structure, every pathway, every corner of the world that had held the shape of your daily life, swallowed and silenced. And knowing in the deep, unavoidable place where human beings keep the truths they most desperately wish they could escape. I was part of why this happened. The guilt arrived not as a single wave, but as a tide that never retreated. Every tree ripped from the earth by the flood was a consequence of a choice they had made. Every soul lost and the souls lost, numbered in the countless, traced a line back through the Nephilim, through the forbidden unions, through the moment each of these women had looked at a being of fallen light and said yes, when every sacred instinct in creation was screaming no. Their love once so intoxicating it had felt like the center of the universe, like the answer to every question the human heart has ever carried now tasted of ash on the tongue. Not just bitterness. Ash, the specific flavor of something that was once alive and burning, that has been reduced to gray, cold, nothing. They fell to the ground, not in ritual but in ruin. Some screamed. Raw, animal, uninhibited screams launched into a silence, so complete it swallowed the sound almost immediately, like the silence itself was indifferent to their pain. Others could not scream. They had passed beyond screaming into something quieter and somehow more devastating, whispered prayers that cracked apart mid-sentence, voices fracturing under the weight of what they were trying to say, hands pressed against faces as though the physical pressure could hold together what was breaking apart internally. They begged. For mercy they weren't sure they deserved. For forgiveness they couldn't calculate the size of. For some signal from the heaven that had just demonstrated its full capacity for judgment, that grace had not been permanently withdrawn. But here is the question that heaven itself seemed to be sitting with, in that long, loaded silence. Can forgiveness reach a heart that helped ignite the greatest judgment the earth had seen since the moment sin entered Eden's garden? Can love, even love that was manufactured and manipulated and weaponized against the one who felt it, truly blind a person so completely that they bear no portion of the weight of what that love produced? Can a woman who gave birth to giants, that devoured the innocent claim she did not know, did not sense, did not, on some level that she chose to silence, understand that what she was participating in was not love but devastation dressed in celestial light? Heaven did not answer immediately. Heaven looked on in a silence that carried its own specific weight. The silence, not of absence, but of deliberation, because while the earth had been cleansed, the account of these women had not been settled. The flood had addressed what walked the earth, but there were still those who had opened the door that let those things in. What would become of them? These women who had carried giants in their bodies, who had danced in the light of fallen angels, who now wept at the ragged edge of eternity, with nothing left to hold on to and everything they had ever chosen now, at the bottom of a sea that had already moved on. The answer was not going to arrive in the form of another flood. Water had done its work. What was coming next was different, more targeted, more personal, more spiritually shattering in the specific way that only divine justice, the kind that knows every detail of every choice, can be. Because Archangel Michael had not sheathed his sword, his assignment was not complete. He was already on his way. And what waited for these women on the other side of his arrival was something that made the flood look, by comparison, like mercy. But not every woman knelt in sorrow. Not every heart shattered under the crushing weight of what had been done. Not every soul standing on the far side of the flood looked inward. and found remorse waiting there. Some looked inward and found something else entirely: defiance. And no one embodied that defiance more completely, more dangerously, more tragically than Nama. Say that name slowly. Nama. Even the sound of it carries something: silk sliding across stone, fire finding fresh fuel, beauty with an edge sharp enough to draw blood. This was not a woman the world overlooked. This was a woman the world remembered, praised for a beauty so extraordinary it stopped conversations mid-sentence, celebrated for a charm so potent it rewrote the decisions of powerful men before they realized their minds had been changed, possessed of a voice so mesmerizing that even the watchers, those fallen angels who had gazed upon all of creation from the heights of heaven, had noticed her above every other woman on the earth. She had always known what she was, and she had never once apologized for it. But beauty without humility before God is not a gift. It is a loaded weapon pointed in the wrong direction, and Nama had spent her entire existence firing it with precision and without conscience. Even after the flood swallowed the world, she had helped corrupt. Even after the waters rose and took everything, every monument to the rebellion she had participated in, every consequence of the choices she had championed, Nama stood tall, unrepentant, unbowed, unbroken in exactly the wrong way. Where the other women wore their guilt like open wounds, Naama wore hers like a gown. But do not mistake the wearing of it for shame. There was no shame in how she carried it. It was woven entirely from defiance, a deliberate, chosen refusal to accept that what she had done was anything other than her right. She had drunk deeply from the cup of forbidden power. She had tasted what it meant to be desired by beings from beyond this world, to hold influence over creatures of celestial fire. And she had liked it, every last drop of it. More than that, she had recruited. She had used her supernatural allure not merely to secure her own place beside a fallen angel, but to draw other women toward the same destruction, whispering in their ears that what heaven called rebellion was actually liberation. Even now, with the evidence of divine judgment still dripping from every surface of the cleansed earth, she looked up at the sky and believed she had been right. That pride, ancient, immovable, crystallized by years of being the most desired creature in any room she entered, had become her prison. But understand the specific architecture of that prison. It was not built from chains or iron bars. It was built entirely from mirrors. Mirrors that reflected only what Naama wanted to see, angled so precisely that the full devastation of her choices never once appeared in the glass. God, whose justice does not merely punish but speaks, whose judgments carry meaning that echoes through eternity, crafted a sentence for Naama and the women who had followed her path that was not simply severe, it was poetic. They were not transformed into beasts. They were transformed into warnings, into sirens, into those haunting, half-human creatures of the deep that every ancient culture across every ocean somehow remembered and recorded and feared. Behind every mythology, behind every sailor's legend of voices rising from the water to pull ships toward the rocks, behind every story of beauty that beckoned from beneath the waves, there is this. There is them. These women, once elevated above all other mortals by the attention of fallen angels, once the most desired and celebrated women on the earth, were now cursed to forever be the very danger they had embodied in life. They remained beautiful, achingly, impossibly, devastatingly beautiful. Voices like music that bypasses the ears and goes directly to the soul. Eyes that held the cold light of stars. But that beauty, every last shimmering piece of it, had been converted into an instrument of ruin, just as the fallen angels they had once loved lured them away from God's protection with the promise of something transcendent. These women would now spend eternity doing the same to others, drawing the living toward destruction with a song they cannot stop singing and a beauty that offers everything and delivers only devastation. Can you hold the full weight of that fate for a moment? To be desired by everyone, loved by no one, to be pursued across every generation, across every ocean, across every human age, and to know, with the complete and unrelenting awareness that constitutes the most refined form of torment, that every soul drawn toward you is a soul being drawn toward ruin, to sing and be unable to stop singing, to be beautiful and be unable to stop being beautiful, and to know, with every note and every glance, that you are not offering what you appear to offer. Jude 1:13 does not flinch from the image. Wild waves of the sea, foaming up their shame, wandering stars for whom the blackest darkness has been reserved forever. Wild waves, foaming shame, wandering without destination through a darkness that has no bottom. The worst part of the punishment was never the transformation itself. Their minds became the most brutal battleground imaginable, some descending into madness, hearing the cries of the drowned rising through the water every time silence fell. Others, going numb, hollowed into walking shadows by a guilt too vast and too specific for any mind to process and survive intact. They tried to forget. The sea never permitted it. The ocean, vast, relentless, indifferent, became simultaneously their prison and their stage. It whispered their names back to them in the dark. It carried the echoes of their past against every current. It reminded them, without pause, without mercy, without the slightest concession to their suffering, of exactly what they were and exactly what they had done. They were no longer women, no longer lovers, no longer mothers. They were consequences given a beautiful face, living warnings wrapped in a song that never ends. And so Naama and those who followed her wander, still hidden inside ancient stories, felt in the pull of storms that rise without warning, heard in the sound the sea makes in the deep of night, when the wind dies down and something beneath the surface seems to call your name. Do not listen. And what of the fallen angels? Not the Nephilim, not the wives, not the sirens singing their eternal warnings from beneath the waves. What of the ones who started all of this, the celestial beings, who looked down from the heights of glory, felt something they were never designed to feel, and chose desire over devotion with full knowledge of what they were doing? The ones now chained in spiritual prisons so deep, so completely sealed from every light of heaven, that the darkness surrounding them was not merely the absence of light, but the presence of something else entirely, the tangible, suffocating weight of divine abandonment. Their bodies were bound. Every impulse to move, to reach, to act, locked behind chains that no created being in any realm possessed the power to break. But here is the detail that transforms imprisonment into something far more refined in its cruelty. Their awareness remained completely, agonizingly open. This was not an accident. This was not an oversight in the architecture of their punishment. This was the deliberate, precise design of a justice that understood exactly where these beings were most vulnerable and placed its blade there with surgical intention. They could not move. They could not speak. They could not intervene in any way, in any direction, across any distance, but they could feel everything. Every cry that rose from the surface of the earth above them landed in their consciousness with full force. Every scream from the women they had once held, now unraveling beneath the weight of an eternal curse, registered not as distant sound but as something closer to direct experience. The sorrow of those transformed souls pressed through the darkness and found them. The madness, that slow, grinding, irreversible dissolution of minds that had been broken by guilt, too enormous to process. They felt it happening in real time, helpless to do anything but receive it. This was not observation. This was participation in consequence, without the ability to alter a single moment of it. They had whispered promises to these women once, promises of transcendence, of being chosen, of a love that existed beyond the ordinary boundaries of mortal life. And now every shattered remnant of those promises came back to them, amplified, undiluted, stripped of every beautiful illusion that had once made the rebellion feel worth its cost. They had chosen this, every step of it, with open eyes and full celestial understanding of what divine law demanded. They had chosen to descend, to take, to corrupt. And this enforced, endless, escape-proof witnessing of everything their choice had produced, this was their harvest. Not death, not oblivion, not even the mercy of unconsciousness, just awareness, permanent, unrelenting, exquisitely targeted awareness of every consequence their rebellion had seeded into the world. Torment does not require fire when it has memory. And these angels had both. Meanwhile, on the other side of that same spiritual landscape, standing in the light that the fallen had permanently forfeited, the angels who had remained faithful received something the fallen would never hold again: purpose. Not the same purpose they had carried before. Something heavier, something shaped by what they had witnessed, because these faithful ones had stood at the same precipice the fallen had tumbled over. They had felt the same pull, do not let anyone tell you otherwise. They had looked down at the same earth, seen the same beauty, experienced the same stirring in places they had never known could be stirred. The temptation was not exclusive to the ones who fell. The difference was the choice. And that choice, that moment of holding the line, when every sensation was pulling them across it, had transformed them in ways that mere obedience, without testing, never could have. They were no longer simply messengers, no longer solely warriors. They had become something the earth desperately needed in the broken, wounded, post-flood world that was now slowly beginning to exhale. Watchers, true ones this time, not the corrupted watchers who had turned their gaze into covetousness, but guardians, forged by the specific fire of temptation, survived. Protectors of a world that had now tasted both the glory of heaven's presence and the devastating weight of heaven's wrath. Sentinels assigned to ensure that the door through which rebellion had entered once would never swing open that wide again. From their posts invisible to human eyes, present in ways that human senses could not fully register, they observed everything. They watched the seas, those restless, churning, ancient waters that now housed the sirens in their eternal, beautiful, ruinous existence. They listened to the songs rising from beneath the waves, haunting melodies threaded through with sorrow so deep it had calcified into something permanent. These sirens had once been connected to the faithful angels by the strange, terrible architecture of a forbidden family tree. Sisters-in-law in the most cosmic sense of that word, part of a lineage that heaven could neither fully claim nor entirely release from memory. The faithful angels did not interfere. The judgment had been rendered by a higher authority than theirs, and they understood with perfect clarity that the boundary between witnessing and intervening was itself sacred. But they listened. They catalogued. They remembered. Because memory, in the economy of heaven, serves a function that goes beyond sentiment. Memory is the architecture of warning, and these angels were now in the business of making sure the warnings held. They also turned their gaze toward humanity, watched the survivors, Noah's descendants, the fragile, tentative beginnings of a world trying to rebuild itself from almost nothing, as they pressed forward, one painful step at a time, village by village, garden by garden, family by family, each one carrying in their blood the inherited knowledge that something catastrophic had happened. Even when the specific details grew blurry across generations, the people tried to forget. Human beings always try to forget what is too large to comfortably carry. But the memory of the flood had embedded itself too deeply into the collective consciousness of the species to ever be fully extracted. It surfaced in dreams. It shaped the way people looked at the sky when clouds gathered. It lived in the stories told by firelight, passed from father to son, mother to daughter, generation to generation, stories about giants and angels, and a sea that rose up and swallowed the entire world. No one ever told the complete truth. The full account was too devastating, too cosmically humbling, too directly implicating of human choice and human consequence to be transmitted without distortion. Pieces were preserved, edges were softened, details were rearranged into shapes that were easier to carry. But no culture that descended from those survivors ever completely let it go, because some things, once known in the bones, cannot be fully forgotten by the mind. It was a new chapter, undeniably. The earth had been washed, and the worst had been removed, and the sky above, a cleansed world, held the specific quality of light that only follows the most complete kind of storm. A rebirth, raw and fragile and real. But clean does not mean undamaged. Washed does not mean unwounded. A world can be scrubbed of its corruption and still carry the scars of what made that cleansing necessary. And those scars, written into the landscape, embedded in the stories, etched into the spiritual atmosphere of a planet that had hosted giants and sirens, and the war between heaven and its own rebels were not going anywhere. The faithful angels understood this with a depth that their pre-temptation selves never could have accessed. They had been bold once, radiantly, perhaps even carelessly bold in the way that beings who have never been truly tested sometimes are. That version of themselves felt distant now, almost naive. What stood in its place was something quieter, more deliberate, more aware of the specific weight carried by every boundary, every divine law, every sacred line drawn into the structure of the universe by a creator who drew nothing arbitrarily. They stood at the edge of glory with their hands folded and their hearts carefully, intentionally guarded. Not because they had stopped caring about the earth below them. The caring had not diminished. If anything, it had deepened, sharpened, become more precise in its focus. But they had watched what happened when caring became craving, when wonder curdled into wanting, when admiration took one step past its appointed boundary and triggered a chain of consequences that swallowed a world. They kept their distance because they now understood the true cost of not keeping it. Some lines are not merely legal boundaries drawn by a God who prefers order. Some lines are structural, load-bearing walls in the architecture of creation itself. Remove them, and everything above them collapses. Cross them, and the collapse does not stop at you. It spreads outward in every direction, gathering speed, consuming everything it touches, until heaven itself is forced to respond with a judgment that grieves the very one who renders it. The fallen angels had learned this truth from the inside of a sealed darkness, with their awareness permanently open and no capacity to look away. The faithful angels had learned it standing at the edge of the same cliff, looking down into the same abyss, and choosing in one eternal, defining moment to step back. The lesson was the same. The classroom was different, and the lesson, soaked in the rain of 40 days and 40 nights, echoed in the thunder that had announced the end of one world and the trembling beginning of another, etched in the sorrow of women, transformed into warnings, and angels transformed into grief. That lesson has never stopped speaking. No matter how luminous the temptation appears, no matter how sovereign the emotion feels in the moment it arrives, no matter how compelling the argument that this particular boundary was made for other people in other circumstances and does not apply to you here and now, there are places sacred, sealed, designated by the hand of the Creator himself, where even the most powerful beings in existence were never designed to go. And the angels who survived with their souls intact remembered. They remember still. So now you know. The story did not end when the floodwaters receded. The world was washed clean, but echoes that deep do not simply disappear. They travel. They resurface. They find every generation that comes after and ask the same unbearable question the fallen angels refused to answer before it was too late. The sirens still sing beneath the waves. The fallen still grieve in sealed darkness. And heaven still watches, remembering with perfect clarity the day love became rebellion, and rebellion became the ruin of an entire world. This is not mythology collecting dust in ancient texts. This is a mirror held directly to your face, because the choices you make, even the ones dressed in the language of love, of destiny, of feeling chosen, carry consequences that stretch far beyond the moment you make them, far beyond yourself, far beyond what you can see from where you are standing right now. The question this story leaves at your feet is the same one those angels ignored until ignoring it cost everything. What are you willing to destroy in pursuit of something God never gave you permission to have? If this message reached something real inside you, drop 777 inches the comments. Let us know you're awake. Thank you to everyone who likes, shares, and subscribes. Your support keeps these truths moving through the world. And to those who give through super thanks, heaven sees your generosity. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. May you walk in wisdom. May you recognize the sirens already singing in your own life. And may you have the God-given strength to turn and walk away. Stay faithful, stay guarded, stay chosen,